I'm gonna bring up well, somebody said about homeschooling in Ontario. We get $600 if we want to homeschool each year. It's nothing compared to what school boards get. That's a little bit about that question. So let me bring up Stephen Reich. Pascal, we'll briefly be on the same screen together. I've got to find my. I think Stephen is. He'll be joining the webinar shortly as he clicks through the steps. Welcome, Stephen. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Hi there. Hi, Pascal.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You guys have been in similar kind of crossover chats in some of the groups that we belong to. Have you ever met in person at all, or spoken with each other?
No.
Well,
No,
this
but
is
I enjoyed your article in the Journal de Montréal that I read. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Pascal. Greatly informative. I think it's going to be more meaningful for people over time. So these videos we're going to archive on the parents. Gosh, where'd it go? Our YouTube channel that Melanie and I host. That is the Weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. We do that in affiliation with Woke Watch Canada, and I think what you've observed will be more powerful and meaningful, certainly as time goes by and more people figure this out. So thank you very much again.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Stephen. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Thank you.
Um, can I extend screen sharing for you? Do you have a
Yes, please.
presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay.
That would be great.
So it looks like I've got multiple participants or hosts or panelists can share. Give it a try. The screen share should be at the bottom.
There we go.
Excellent.
Just waiting for it to.
And well, can you tell us a bit about yourself, Stephen,
Sure. Yeah,
before
absolutely.
you launch in here?
Before I
And
dive in, so I am I'm going to be a PhD candidate beginning in the fall at OISE, which is the Faculty of Education at the University of Toronto. In my previous life, I've been a lawyer. I've also been a professional actor. I'm a musician. But I really got interested in educational policy watching my son go through school, and particularly the differences at a point in elementary school. We moved him to a somewhat more of a classical school in Toronto in our neighborhood. And the differences that I saw between what was going on in a regular school, and certainly once he finished that at the end of grade six, and then going to public school for high school, there was just no comparison. So I became very interested in what was going on in schools and school policy. And yeah, so that's why I began to study it. And it was really at that time where I began my coursework at OISE that I became conversant in critical theory, which is, some people will call wokeism. I prefer not to use that term because it can be a little polarizing, even though I know that that's kind of the term that people understand and use. But I like to use the term critical theory or contemporary critical theory to kind of elevate the discussion and talk about it in terms of a philosophy that is now colonized education, not only in Ontario, across Canada, the United States, although there is some pushback, but really throughout the Anglosphere. So that's all the English speaking countries and even into non English speaking countries. So that's a little bit about me. And You want me to get started?
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this, Stephen. Thank you for joining us again. And for viewers, Stephen Reich presenting. If you've got questions, there is a Q&A box or a button at the bottom of your screen. You can type questions in as we go. I likely will save them up until Stephen is done his presentation, and then we can further the conversation at that point. Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
All right, thank you very much. So I wanted to start off really, I'm going to be talking about identity and what that really means. And the first question I kind of want to put out there rhetorically, because obviously you're not in front of me as a live audience, you can't answer. But let's say in the year 2000, who ever said, I identify as, and then fill in the blank? Nobody. No one talked about identifying as anything. You know, if someone is Italian, they wouldn't say I identify as Italian, they would say I'm Italian. Or, you know, I identify as a man. No, they would say I am a man. So this is really something that has leaked out of the study of psychology, really in universities and talking about identity as part of personality. So what's really happened is that these ideas have kind of leaked out of psychology and taken on a new meaning. And that's really what we're going to be looking at today. So what is identity? So identity is a subjectively felt but politically useful affiliation with groups that are specifically identified by critical theory and pedagogy as allies in the quest for societal revolution. It's part of the operation of critical theory. So, you know, here we have on this slide, what is identity? It is about not you, it's about you feeling oppressed, it's politically useful, defined by group membership, and the purpose of having an identity, and this is really important, is not about your own self-growth, but rather for you to ally with other groups in order to have a societal revolution. So just digging into this a little bit more, identity, we take a look, is now really defined along these parameters. Your race or skin color, your gender identity, or sexuality, and whether or not you're indigenous. So that leaves out tons that is part of our personalities. For example, your identity is not your interests, it's not your talents, it's not your careers and hobbies, and it's not your socioeconomic status. And that one is really, really important because all the studies show that the biggest determiner of whether or not you were going to do well in school, as the way school operates right now, is your socioeconomic status. And somehow that's just fallen off the wayside. So what is critical theory? Critical theory is a neo-Marxist postmodern critique, and I'll explain that, dividing society into oppressors and the oppressed in order to remake society into one that centers the oppressed and their claims on resources. So, you know, here in this diagram, you know, thumbs down for the majority, thumbs down for successful minorities, that immigrants that come to Canada that want to become part of the Canadian fabric, thumbs down to them, thumbs down to anyone working to overcome any obstacles that they have in their lives. And as I said, most of those obstacles tend to be socioeconomic. So what is critical theory really centering? It's the idea of being a victim. And what we want to do in critical theory, and by saying we, I don't mean me, I'm saying the people that promote this, is that we want to take all these victims and put them together so that they become a group of victims. Now, what do we do with these victims? So we have this group of victims, and now we want to engage in identity building. And this is really critical pedagogy. It's the method and goal of teaching promoted in Ontario, throughout Canada, really, both by the government, the school boards, and the teachers' unions. Now, critical pedagogy goes under a few different names. You may have seen it if you do look at parent resources. Sometimes it's called culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, which in Ontario Ministry of Education documents is shortened to CRRP or CRAP. But what is that? So it's creating a classroom where each student is not an individual, but is rather an avatar of their race, ethnicity, and their gender identity. But not in terms of the positives of it and the positives of what they bring into the classroom, but really only in terms of their victimhood. The educational goal is to build up those identities, inculcating students with the principles of critical theory that Pascal discussed and Chantal alluded to in her slides, um, so that they can then decenter. These are the words that are used: decolonize, disrupt. And who are they decentering, decolonizing, and disrupting? The majority that just happens to exist by no fault of their own, just by birth in this country. Successful minorities, those who are immigrants to the country that with one, two, or three generations become successful and integrated Canadians, and anyone working hard to overcome whatever obstacles that life has thrown their way, including life circumstances such as poverty. So that's really what it's aiming to do. It wants to really fight against, the thumbs down people. But otherwise, critical pedagogy really, in terms of what goes on in the classroom, it's about letting students do what they want, as long as what they're doing stereotypically fits their racial, sexual, gender identities, and is useful in that sense to build these coalitions to decenter, decolonize, and disrupt. So you look at it this way and you go, well, so what does this have to do with English or history, social studies, math? It has nothing to do with it. In fact, critical theory is opposed to traditional subjects and assessments. Critical theory really is there to cut ties with things that we used to celebrate as Canadians in society, multiculturalism. So this may seem a little bit weird because we sort of think of critical theory, well, doesn't it promote multiculturalism? No, it doesn't. Actually, if you read the scholars that write about critical theory, they hate multiculturalism because multiculturalism is saying, hey, we're all in this country together. We have different backgrounds, we have different heritages, ethnicities that we may feel affiliations to. We celebrate different holidays. Let's share that with everybody. We'll have street festivals, we'll have different events. No, because that doesn't help in the goal of critical theory, which is, again, to decenter and to dismantle. So again, national pride, that's not something that we want to promote. History, no, because history is complex and history has many different sides. And if we really want to examine history, then we're looking at it chronologically and we're examining all the different influences that brought us to today. So we don't want to do that. We want to have one narrative about why we've turned into this horrible, horrible society that needs dismantling. The other thing that critical pedagogy doesn't like is facts, science, or objectivity. And we're going to get to that in a bit because it's really a theory that is not grounded in any evidence. And by evidence, I mean experimental evidence. And critical theorists will often say, well, we have evidence. And by evidence, they mean that a researcher will go out there and talk to three like-minded individuals and talk about how they feel that their whiteness is something they project in a classroom, and therefore it's oppressive to other students. Now, is there evidence that they're actually doing that? Have they defined their terms? Do we have surveys of these students saying that they don't feel that they belong? No, we have none of that. We just have people sort of talking and theorizing. And I would argue that that's not the kind of evidence that we want to base policy on. And of course, and this is perhaps relevant to today, that critical theory is really against the family. And the family is an institution which may stand in its way. That's very similar to Marxism's project to indoctrinate young children to cut ties with the past in order to disrupt present systems of authority. And the family would be one present system of authority, of course, the parents being the authority. Now, let's talk about, on the other side, the people that promote critical pedagogy. They say it's necessary. So has there been any work done, any studies done to see whether or not it actually does anything productive? Does it close achievement gaps? Does it help people learn better? So I looked at this. There's no research at all in Canada. There's a little bit of research in the United States where people tried to use, because they do have standardized tests and standardized, feelings of student climate, to see, what are the effects of critical pedagogy on students. And the literature really only supports 5 substantiated outcomes. And these are the outcomes: the belief in critical theory's tenets as established facts, the belief that science is a myth, the belief that collective struggle against the status quo is a moral imperative. So after being educated through critical pedagogy, we test the students in terms of what they feel that they've learned, what they believe. This is what they end up with. But all the students, remember, critical pedagogy is really focusing on someone's identity. Now, this was developed in the United States, where we have segregated schools, which often will have one population. So you'll have native-born African-American students in one school, maybe a smattering of Hispanics, but maybe very few students from other ethnic groups, and what in the United States often gets categorized as the white population. So in one school where everybody is the same, this poses less of a problem. But in schools that do have other groups, such as Hispanics or people from other countries, what we found through experimentation is that this leaves the non-focus groups feeling excluded from the class. And for the students that belong to the group that that pedagogy was directed to, it leaves students feeling as if they don't belong to society as a whole. So we have studies that show this, that the Black students that are in the United States that are exposed to this come out feeling like, well, should I bother trying in school? Like, will I ever get ahead? These are systemic barriers. What's the point? I'm not really part of this society. And that's something that John McWhorter, if any of you follow him, writes a lot about like how disincentivizing that is, and what a terrible message to teach children, that they are never ever going to be able to be successful because they are outsiders. Now, critically, and I mean that in terms of importantly, there's no evidence that critical pedagogy improves academic performance whatsoever. And here I have the references from those studies. So let's talk about a few of the other terms that come about because of critical theory that I think really require definition. And I think for the parents out there, the teachers out there, you need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So let's start with equity. And I think this diagram sets it up very well. Equity has nothing to do with equal or fair access, even equal or fair access where we consider that someone may be starting from a deficit because they don't have enough background knowledge, or that they came from a home where their parents didn't have books, or their parents couldn't afford to take them to museums or on holidays. That's not what equity is about. Equity, really, when we distinguish it from equality, is about securing the same outcome for everybody. And what that and I always say, let's operationalize that, as Shannon mentioned. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, it basically means great inflation, that everyone gets a prize for producing anything, and it doesn't really matter what it is. And one of the popular things that goes on, for example, in schools, and if you have any children that are, I would say later elementary school and all the way through high school, is they get a project, do a project on, it's very broad, anything in history that was a conflict. And so, students will then go and they'll copy a Wikipedia page, they'll put it into a slides, they'll rearrange the wording, they'll use the references as their own references, they'll populate it with a bunch of Google images, and they submit it to the teachers, who now have a 4-point way of evaluating. And as long as you've done all of this, you get 4 out of 4. Is anything learned? No. Is anyone going to remember anything of this, 6 months later, in terms of the student who did it? No. But everyone, on a 4-point average, if you, sort of ticked all the boxes, you're going to get 4 out of 4 or something close to 4 out of 4. And that's why we see students like everyone, we look at the averages in Ontario and we see they're in the high 80s and the 90s, to get into university now. We assume that, you have to have marks in the 90s for specialized program in the upper 90s. I mean, that's ridiculous. When I went to school on the bell curve, the average was 65. The smartest students in the class got 80, and it was that one exceptional student every couple of years that got in the 90s. So, let's be clear. When we talk about equity, we're talking about engineering equal outcomes, and particularly equal outcomes by the groups that critical theory is interested in. And those are race and gender identity, for the most part. They say sexuality, they've kind of lost interest in sexuality. All right, diversity. So again, we talk about diversity, sounds like a great thing. One thing that I always say is we live in Canada. Like, we don't have to have a policy of diversity. We already are diverse. We have people that come from families and cultures from all around the world. Plus, we've got First Nations, we've got the Métis, we've got the Inuit. We have a diverse society. This is go traveling, go to a country that's pretty homogeneous, and you will notice right away, oh my God, everyone looks the same. Everyone, is doing the same thing. Everyone, speaks the same language. Well, that's not the case in most Anglosphere countries. We already have diversity. So then what are they talking about when they want to promote diversity? So when they want to promote diversity, what they're really talking about is the presence of specified identity groups that are viewed as marginalized. Okay, now what do we mean by marginalized? And there's another term that is often overused. They don't mean poor, right? Which really is the on the ground fact of what marginalizes people is poverty, not being able to access resources because you can't pay for them. And a good example of that is tutoring. So the middle class, parents, their kid is getting all these projects, they can't handle them. The parents don't have time to do it. They hire tutors, or they're doing discovery math in school. They're getting problems that have never been explained to the kids. So the parents hire tutors. Well, what is the systemic barrier? The systemic barrier is not the color of your skin. If you are of Jamaican heritage and your father's a surgeon and your mother's a university professor, and you live in a house and you've got a pool or whatever, the barrier for you is not the color of your skin. Your parents can hire you tutors, they can send you to the best schools, no problem, right? The barrier is really poverty. So, but they're not interested in that. What they want to see is they want to center and front sort of these marketing images of here's what diversity is. But what is diversity is not, as you can see in the lower pictures, is just children and their various interests and their different personalities, their different ways of thinking, the different ways that they've been parented. That is not at all of interest to critical theory. Inclusion. So we seem to think that inclusion just means, oh, everyone's included. Well, that's not what it means under critical theory. Critical theory says that inclusion is centering the lived experiences of specified identity groups viewed by critical theory as marginalized. So who is embraced in this idea of inclusivity? Well, here we have the various gender identities, and as Chanel Fall has presented, that we see a lot of this in classrooms where elementary school kids are coloring flags for agendered or bisexual or all these sort of various identities. They've taken a like to Black Lives Matter. It seems since October 7th they've taken a love of Palestinian nationalism and Islam. So all those things are included. What is not included is anything that is suspected of whiteness. And by whiteness, that's just a term that means everything that we say is majority or bad. Again, by virtue of birth. If right now the majority of Canadians happen to be pale skinned, it's only because Canada started off as a country that was colonized by people of British heritage and whatever. But now we're even applying that to ethnic groups. We're saying that, to Asians, that you're now white adjacent. We're saying that to Jews, you're white adjacent. To South Asians, you're white adjacent. The idea of Canada as having any pride in Canada is not something to be celebrated. If people have different religions other than Islam, it appears that we don't celebrate that either. Like somehow, this whole idea of what Judaism is, and the fact that it does center Israel. So there's an element of Zionism in Judaism. That's bad. Christianity is bad. That's all seen as bad. Hinduism now is bad, and they're responsible for all the evil that goes on within their communities. So again, inclusion is not about including everyone. It's again about putting together these identity groups. So what is social justice? So social justice is both a process and a goal. As a process, it's the act of becoming critically conscious of one's privilege or marginality, okay, based on the rules of critical theory. So you are assigned either to be marginalized or to be privileged based on very surface characteristics, your skin color, I hate to use the term race because race doesn't really exist, but let's say your geographic ancestry, in terms of your phenotype, so that somehow if you're European, and it doesn't matter like whether your family's from Britain or your family's from Albania or Turkey or an Arab country. And there again, like it depends on where we draw the lines. In Canada, Arabs are sort of carved out as a separate group. In the United States, they're counted in the white category. I mean, these categories are meaningless, really. So, you're supposed to reflect on whether or not you're privileged or marginalized, and then you're supposed to continually testify as to your positionality and hope for this socialist revolution. And as a goal, social justice is supposed to get you to this unspecified utopia of liberation and freedom. Unfortunately, you can read the literature, to your eyes fall out, and you will see no plan or design for implementation or what even this utopia is supposed to look like. So, my question is always, listen, education talks a lot about transformational change. We want transformational change. And I always say, I'll get on board the change train when I know what the destination looks like. And if you can't illustrate for me the destination, and we can't have a societal discussion about what that destination looks like and whether there's unintended consequences or whether maybe it's a bad idea, then I'm not getting on board. And I say that for the teachers that are here, for the parents that are here, really think about what are we talking about here? So I'm going to share a few things that Chanel has shared on Twitter, just to talk about how much is this identity stuff really kind of leaking into the classroom. Because then we're going to look at it from the ministry perspective. So here's the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, their gender and pronoun material for kindergarten classroom use. Now you'll notice on the left, the critical theory, this is the early years document, and many of you have probably seen that. If you want, I'll be quiet just for a second so you can just take a quick look at that. And so basically here, they're providing materials, and this would be kindergarten. So we're talking about ages, 3.5 to 5.5, where we know developmentally and psychologically children are very concrete thinkers. Children are only learning the terms that we use so that when we communicate with each other, we understand what we're talking about. For example, this is a coffee cup. We call this a coffee cup so that we all know what we're talking about. These are not university students who are examining Judith Butler's theories about gender performativity or whatever. These are young children, and somehow this seems to have more importance than, for example, learning how to set a table and make lunch for your classmates and eat together and with manners and clean up after yourselves, or learn Canadian folk songs, or all the other things that we could do. This seems to be a big priority. So this is the Elementary Teacher Federation materials for use in kindergarten. And if you look on the left-hand side, the connections to CRRP or CRAP, cultural competence, so that's we're talking about the critical consciousness, the honors, the lived realities of the learners, and how they may identify with themselves on the inside. Okay, so we're now talking about like therapy in kindergarten, right? I mean, that's what we do in therapy. Like if you're struggling with an issue or you feel that you have a block as a person, and now I'm speaking as like as an adult or even a later teen or whatever, you go to therapy, you will work with a therapist who's qualified to deal with these issues and talk about, you know, who you are, what is important to you, you know, what are your behavioral patterns? Is this, you know, and I ask the question as we go through this, is this really appropriate for a 3.5-year-old to 5-year-old? Like, should we be engaging in therapy? And a better question, should teachers who have absolutely no training in this be engaging in this kind of therapy in the classroom? So then we look, it's tied to critical consciousness. Have learners or has learners consider how we can make space for gender inclusivity? So again, gender inclusivity, we may understand that as adults. I have my doubts that any 3.5-year-old or 5-year-old understands that. Has learners represent the various ways that they might express who they are on the inside and how that will challenge gender normativity. So now we have therapy that has been repurposed for challenging what we saw in the slide before, the majority, challenging just the names that we give things. You know, let's not call this a coffee cup. Let's call this a blip. Instead, you know, is this really appropriate for this age? And you know, these children, like there's so many things that need to be learned to prepare yourself for academic work in grade 1. Again, I question, you know, how much time is being spent on this, or how much easier it is that for a teacher to take these materials and do this in class that doesn't require the teacher to be an expert in how to, for example, teach children how to read. And again, you know, we're promoting social identities, and again, not your full identity, your interests, the myriad ways that we have a personality, but only around the axes of gender, sexuality, and again, 3.5 to 5-year-olds. You know, if you have children and you've talked, like, do they know their sexuality? Is this an appropriate conversation for someone who's not a parent or not an expert to be having in a kindergarten classroom? Race, you know, it reminds me of my son. I remember when he was about this age looking at pictures, and I remember he said to me, "Oh, look at the, you know, look at the picture of the black person." And what he was talking about was the person who was wearing a black shirt, right? Because he didn't see that. His best friend was Japanese, and you know, he thought that they looked the same because they had the same haircut. So, you know, is this really what we want to be fronting to the kids right now? What are the consequences of you know, teaching kindergarten kids that they're not all children and that they're not all together and they're all part of the Canadian experiment, but rather that they belong to these little siloed identities? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a bit of my research, and my research really was looking at 40 years of Ministry of Education publications in Ontario that had to do, you know, both internally, board directives, curricular documents, teacher resources, and the actual curricula for each subject. So everything I could find online from around the 1980s to 2022, because I wanted to see the trends. And that's the type of research that's been done. There's a scholar, David Rosado, who does this about media and agency setting by, say, the media and activists. And I wanted to see, well, what was really going on at the ministry level, right? At the real political level in Ontario in education. So what I'm going to be showing you is, much of it is for my thesis, is the Ontario Ministry of Education promoting critical theory in K-12 education. So between 1992 and 2022, there has been a 187% increase in use of the term identity as defined by critical theory. And I'm going to give you a working definition the number of scholars have used in synthesizing the literature. that identity, its elaboration, its expression and affirmation to fight oppression against the so-called privileged is a mobilization of racial, gender, and sexuality minority groups against current majority groups who are implicated in malfeasance, bad behavior, solely for the reason that they happen to be born into the majority. So that's really what identity is. When we think about it that way, then we realize identity contributes nothing to actually teaching children anything about subjects they know nothing about, and it doesn't really contribute to having a full personality. But what is it important for? It's for producing social unrest, pitting these groups against those groups. The notion of identity was introduced into the curriculum by Bob Rae's NDP government in 1993, and that was right after the LA riots and then the copycat Toronto riots after the beating up of Rodney King. There was a bit of a panic. Certainly justifiably in the States where there were issues, but then there was a panic in Canada as well. Some of it justified by some police behavior, but it was a real panic in terms of the Ministry of Education, saying that students now have to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. So it's not that you go to school to learn things you don't know, to open the proverbial window to the outside world that is beyond your ken, but rather the focus of school should be on you. So the focus of school is like me learning. And just to give you an example of how limiting that is, if you come from the middle class, the upper classes, you've traveled, you have books, your parents take you to the ROM, which is a museum in Toronto or whatever, then you have, sort of your window's already been open to some degree. Now, if you are living in Ontario housing and you have a single mother and 3 siblings, and your single mother's working 3 jobs to put food on the table, and there's no money for books and there's no money for trips, and maybe that single mother doesn't speak English as her first language, and maybe she's a new Canadian and she doesn't know how to negotiate all the different things that maybe are provided for free, then your world is pretty small. Like your world might be your 1 or 2 bedroom apartment and the playground next door, right? So a curriculum focused only on you and your lived experience is going to be pretty limiting and certainly isn't going to be opening any doors for you, right? Other than navel gazing. So then we see in 2012 this huge, sort of jump. And that was because of the Kathleen Wynne government's promotion of identity in new curriculum. So that suddenly, math is not just about math, and science is not just about science. Social studies isn't about learning about different cultures around the world or the history of Canada. It's now about your identity, and now pinning identities on people in the past who never thought of themselves as having any identity. So now, instead of learning history, we want to figure out, well, how might that person have identified themselves? And by that identity, so it's like we want to take the present, and this is called presentism, and we want to apply it historically the past and then judge the past based on, what present era we're in. Now, interestingly enough, we see another jump, and this is during the Doug Ford years, 2017 to 2022. And that's because the government released its education equity plan with a directive to strengthen critical pedagogy and convey the concerns of critical theory. And as they say, making explicit existing structures, policies, programs, and practices that disadvantage, who do they disadvantage? The racialized, okay, which is the new term for visible minorities. But what they really mean here is Black Canadians, Indigenous students, students who identify as LGBTQ, and that includes all of the other acronyms that have been added to that, Two-Spirited, which would apply to, I suppose, Indigenous people that have, gender identities or a sexuality that is not heterosexual. It's unclear what that term really means. It's a very recent invention. And then the scholars of education that come out of the education school say, well, this has been a good thing because now we're not promoting academic achievement and closing gaps. We're promoting identity and well-being, right? Now, who loves identity and well-being, the whole well-being thing? The upper middle class, the elites, right? That are doing all their well-being stuff, right? The people who have struggled to put food on the table, or who are struggling just to read, whatever, are not so worried about their well-being and doing meditation or whatever. They've got very on the ground concerns. And what this did, this identity and well-being policy by the ministry, was to displace previous policy objectives that were really prioritizing academic achievement and closing achievement gaps. Now, critical theorists argue that classical liberalism, and I want to really give a definition here because I think sometimes people use liberal, and I've heard it in the discussions even today, that liberal meaning left, conservative meaning right. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about liberalism as an idea from the Enlightenment that we have natural rights, we have individual rights, claims that we can make. We have a system that processes them, that we believe that we shouldn't judge people by their exterior. Martin Luther King Jr. was a perfect example of liberalism, the idea that everyone is God's child, that is born equal, and that it's an affront to God to treat people according to surface things such as their skin color or what they look like. That everyone deserves dignity and everyone deserves an opportunity, right? So classical liberalism loves equal opportunity, and it also promotes merit, because the only way that you're going to have a society that advances, solves problems, is if we have things in motion for people that truly are gifted. And I'm not talking about the gifted programs that we have now in schools, which are really a farce based on a test that you take and it shows that, oh, you've got a quick working memory, so now you're gifted. You may not be able to read, but you're very gifted in that, or you're gifted in math, but you can't control your outbursts. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the people who are going to be the future Einsteins, the future inventors, the future people that come out with medical things. Liberalism promotes merit, right? And says that everyone should have equal opportunity, and the only limiting factor is going to be your own hard work, your motivation, and what you're born with in terms of your smarts. Critical theory doesn't believe in that at all. And they say, that classical liberalism is against equity, which it is, because it doesn't believe in equal outcomes. Classical liberalism isn't interested in your group identity because it's not interested in those surface characteristics. It's not interested in unearned privileges because there's nothing you can do with them. Like a child that is born into a rich house with educated parents, classical liberalism says, well, that's just how the cookie rolls. Life is not fair. Life is not a bowl of cherries. The most that we can do is ensure that child, when they start school, if we're putting it in an education context, when they start school, that we have to start and organize school in such a way that the child that comes from that Ontario housing, the child that comes from Rosedale or Kerrisdale in Vancouver or whatever, that we ensure when we start to teach that they all have the same background knowledge, and that we start from the beginning with both of them so that they both have equal access. And then classical liberalism would be interested in making sure that we create a system where people can't game the system. So, for example, if we had a system that there was no need to hire tutors, whatever, we'd be taking that game out, and we'd be ensuring equal access for poor students whose parents can't afford to pay for tutors. That would be classical liberalism. Critical theory, though, isn't interested in that. They're interested in equal outcomes. So let's look at, in terms of my findings, how has critical theory that we've been discussing colonized education? Well, the ministry in Ontario is increasingly, to the tune of 1,730%, infusing the tenets of critical theory into public education. And that's from 1982. In addition, critical theory's delivery mechanism, critical pedagogy, has seen a 1,825% growth since 2002, when that term first entered into ministry policy documents. Now, if you thought that maybe it was the government of the day who influences how much critical theory is in the curriculum, you'd be wrong. The progressive conservatives under Doug Ford have actually used 83% more critical theory language in publications aimed at students in the K-12 classroom. So by that I mean the various curriculums and the teacher resource materials. 83% more than previous liberal governments. So, they can talk a good game about we're going back to basics, and, they'll throw in a few words here and there. And we're going to look at some examples of, some of the reformations of the curriculum. The bureaucracy underneath them is keeping going, producing more and more of this critical theory language at the expense of, what learning really requires, which we're going to take a quick look at. So let's look at the term identity as we've been talking. If we compare the language curriculum that was put out by the Liberals in 2006 and that put out by the Progressive Conservatives in 2023, we see a 2,233% increase in use of the term identity by the PCs. Now, just to give you context, the reason why the PCs came out with this new curriculum is because the Ontario Human Rights Commission had a right to read report where they examined the problems with, what they said was a workforce in Canada that 40% of our workforce is functionally illiterate, and that 30% of our students are functionally illiterate. And by that, I mean that they don't have the stamina for long reading, and they don't because they don't have automaticity in reading. Now, granted, that study was just looking at very early years in terms of phonics, and that's not the only way that we teach reading. I mean, it is the way we have to start teaching reading, but there's more to it than that. And the Ontario Human Rights Commission said that, unfortunately, the ministry, the unions, the teacher colleges, teachers themselves, principals, they're too concerned about sociocultural matters, right? And that they're letting that distract them from their real job, which is teaching. So the sociocultural matters are really another way of saying critical theory and identity. So, what has the Conservative government done? It's inserted even more. So let's look at math. The previous math curriculum in 2005, the word identity used in the critical theory sense, not in the mathematical sense, does not appear anywhere in the curriculum. Now it does in 2020. Now, obviously, we can't do a percentage because we went from 0 to more. For those of you who might be interested, I can explain kind of how this works in terms of the 3.71 per 10,000 words. But that's a significant increase in terms of this entering into the math curriculum and displacing math education. So what are the problems with an identity-focused school system? Actually, just before that, I just wanted to show you, this is critical theory language by subject matter. So you can see on the left that most of the critical theory language is found in pedagogical guidance. So, they're basically in all the documents for teachers telling them, you should be using critical theory. But mathematics on the right is the least amount so far. But let's remember, none of it existed prior to 2005. And what we're looking at in this graph is the whole 40 years. So that's actually quite significant that only since 2023, or let's say 2005, that because there have been other math things that have been put out that have referred to identity, that there is this in mathematics. But here's the really interesting finding. If you look in the middle of the graph, third from the left, we've got the humanities, language, history, social studies, and we see the amount of critical theory language. And then we look at science and technology, and there's actually more of it in science and technology than there is in the humanities, which goes to show you that the people promoting critical theory, they're not just looking at correcting history. They may talk about that or just language or whatever. This is about repurposing all of the subject matter in school for societal revolution. Uh, so that said, what's the problem with identity focus in schools? Well, identity focus steals time away from and energy uh, from other subject matters and from a proper focus on teaching methods. For example, critical pedagogy says every child and every identity group learns differently and has a particular learning style. So that's what they say, that if you belong to this race, like the black race, that you learn differently than someone from the brown race or from the white race. Okay. Now, what does cognitive science say? They say there's no evidence substantiating learning styles, that these are surfacey categorizations that aren't even really based on biology. Like we're inside, we're not that different. Just because our ancestors came from a certain geographical location, we're having more or less melanin in your skin or a different kind of hair texture was beneficial because of the geography of the place that you lived in. I mean, that is irrelevant and certainly irrelevant in an education system. So there is no scientific evidence substantiating learning styles. It's a complete myth. Someone made it up. The way humans learn is universal and does not vary by race. It does not vary by indigeneity, which is something even the Canadian Human Rights Commission found in their Right to Read report. I mean, they said, Indigenous people learn to read the same way as all other people because they're people. And it doesn't matter what your gender identity is or your level of oppression. The problem is critical theory is blind to the science of learning. It's unable to recognize the complexity of that science, the evidence it's uncovered to validate theories about the human mind operates. So unlike critical theory, the science of learning has a proven empirical record of demonstrating practical ways in which teachers can make knowledge and skills stick and be available for future problem learning situations. So, you have to ask yourself, if you spend all this time doing projects and learning and investigating, whatever, and 6 months later, you have even just an oral quiz in the classroom, by doing all those things, the kids are not going to remember anything. It's all going to be gone. Science actually has a way to make sure that a year later, 2 years later, this stuff has been committed to long-term memory so that you don't forget it. So there was a point in spending time during the school day actually learning it. So instead of that, critical theory assumes that a student's lived experience, and I don't know what the difference between lived experience and just experiences, because obviously you don't have experiences when you're dead. So laundered through the demands of critical theory, that should be the primary source and subject of learning. There's no evidence that actually advances learning. It doesn't advance the student's long-term repository of knowledge that needs to be available automatically for problem serving. What has the research shown? Well, the research has shown that engaging in these kind of identity politics and dividing people into these identity categories by fronting and focusing on identity may actually be related to a lower sense of well-being and strongly associated with increased depression. So the focus on identity and the politics of identity relies on a narrative that you tell yourself, and the ministry says that, which has been found to lead to undependable reason, right? Because you're telling yourself a narrative and there's no correction, there's no tethering it to reality, operationalizing it, making it real. And it's solely based on one's emotions of the moment. And thus, there's a loss of logical perspective, right? Now, what is the best way to be mentally healthy? Is to have a sense of logical perspective. I may feel a certain way, I may be enraged right now, but if I have a sense of logical perspective, I'm able to say, but you know what? I have a roof over my head, I have food on the table, I have people that love me. This is how I'm feeling right now. That's okay. I need to go for a walk. I'll calm down. Then I'll be able to look at it rationally. So if we don't have logical perspective, it leads some individuals to interpret mild forms of distress as mental health problems. And that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy and the genuine experience of even greater symptomology. So I'm not denying that these people don't feel distress. They do, but it's self-generated, right? It's self-generated. Obviously, this has ramifications in terms of children deciding that all of their problems are related to finding the right gender identity. And I mean, gender identity is not my my area of expertise. There's probably people here that can speak to that more. But just speaking in terms of identity, like to say that my problems come down to, my racial, gender, sexuality, these identities, it's very simplistic. Now, I mean, what does the Canadian public think of doing this at school, that this should be the focus of school? So Eric Kaufman, a sociologist, his research demonstrates that the Ministry of Education in Ontario is wildly out of step with Canadian public opinion. And that means, because public education is a public civic good that people pay for with their taxes, right? So it should have some accountability to the public. If the public thinks that the purpose of public education is to give their children enough knowledge and skills that then they can negotiate the world as an adult, but yet what the system is trying to do is to foment revolution so that we can, enter social justice utopia, then, there's a breach of the social contract between public education and the public that it's supposed to serve. So what does Eric Kaufman's research say? So 92% of Canadians are against categorizing identities as privileged and oppressed. 92%, which is what our education system is currently doing. 85% of Canadians are against teaching that there's no such thing as biological sex, only gender. Okay, again, that's a large percentage. 62% of Canadians don't want a curriculum tailored to identities. They want a broad, common curriculum that everybody gets, right? And they see that as equitable, not separate curriculums for different races or different gender identities. So now we get to the part of the discussion that hopefully will lead to some questions. What can you do? So, to the parents here in the audience, I would say you have to be the first educator at home. Like if you think that the schools are going to, raise your children and give them the education that they need, you're mistaken. That's not where we're at. Now, I'm going to add a proviso here. If your child you suspect your child has, a sexual or gender dysphoria, however we talk about that, in terms of being uncomfortable, disliking, hating their body, or paraphilia, right? Then you need to seek appropriate counseling for your child, right? This is not something for the schools to do. Teachers have no training in it. You are the one that needs to find appropriate counseling for your children. And that's an issue that they have to work through that requires therapy. Okay, not necessarily to rid them of those feelings, but for them to come to terms with them in a healthy way. But in all other cases, so that proviso aside, this is what I would say, and this is what I've been doing. Don't use critical theory language and don't use postmodernist terminology. Stop saying, I identify as blank. How do you identify, or whatever? Talk in real terms, right? If you're Italian, say I'm Italian. If you're an artist, say I'm an artist. Then it's a lot more meaningful when someone says I'm a singer as opposed to I identify as a singer. When I hear the word I identify as a singer, it sounds to me like you're actually not a singer. You've chosen a costume, you're going to put it on, and we're all going to pretend you're a singer when you're not. So don't use these terms. Don't use the term identity, right? Unless you're a psychology major or a psychologist that's discussing personality. Talk to your kids about sex. And I'm not talking about sexuality, and I'm not talking about the act of sex. I'm talking about sex. You are the ones that are responsible for your children having pride in their bodies, which is something they can't do anything about, right? My son had a kindergarten teacher who used to say, you get what you get and you don't get upset. And I've always thought that's one of the wisest things I've ever heard, right? Your body is your body, and it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be exactly to your liking, and no one has the body that, is in the magazines or whatever. You have to learn to love your body and accept your body and change what you can and accept what you can't, the serenity prayer. That's something that you can talk about with your kids. And also to talk about the biological reality of their sex. What does that mean, right? For them to understand, okay, well, you have a penis. So, what are your responsibilities around having a penis? What are, how do you take care of your penis? How do you make sure it's healthy? What does that look like biologically? For girls, the same thing. And then crosswise, like, again, if you're comfortable, and some people may not be, or they may have religious objections, but to talk to your children about the biological realities of sex. And connected to that is to talk to them about how sex stereotypes were put to bed because of second wave feminism. And that we dispensed with this idea that because you were born with a penis or because you were born with a vulva, that you have to act in certain ways. That if you're born with a vulva, that means that you have to be a homemaker that raises children or whatever. You can choose to do that, but the options open to you in terms of what you can do are much broader than that. Or that if you're born with a penis, that you can't be an emotional person or artistic or sensitive or a good parent. I mean, those are stereotypes, and they're not stereotypes that have existed forever. These are stereotypes based on 1950s sort of Hollywood representations of middle class life, right? Because in the 1800s, both men and women worked, and they worked hard hours in the field, and women were not, walking around figuring out how to put perfume and how to do their hair to be more attractive to their husbands, and all that other stuff that we saw in the 50s. And men didn't expect to come in and have someone give them a martini and put on their slippers. So I question whether or not a lot of, what we're calling gender identity or non-conforming is that what you're measuring yourself up against is some ideal from movies from the 1950s. And that's a discussion you can have with children. That's a very interesting discussion. And to say to your kids that your biology does not fully define you. Yes, it puts limitations on you. If you have a penis, you're not going to be able to get pregnant and have babies. But all these other things are open to you. In terms of, if you have young children there and they're at school and that this is coming down the pipe, I don't think there's anything wrong with talking to your kids. They may come to the conclusion, and certainly as a parent, you have the right to, when you're talking about them, about the importance of their sex or whatever, that they don't have an identity, right? And that your kids can say to their teacher in class when they're given that gingerbread form, you know what? I don't have an identity. I have sex. I have interests. Other people may struggle accepting their biological sex. I don't, right? And that's why I gave the proviso that if they do, then that's your responsibility, right? But steal your children, steal them in terms of having a strong back that they themselves are their own advocates to say, what, I'm really, I'm not comfortable yet with fractions. So I would rather do fractions. Or can we learn our multiplication tables instead of coloring this in because I don't have an identity? I don't know how much point there is bringing this up with teachers who seem committed to this. They probably haven't given it a lot of thought. They're mandated to do it by the ministry and the school boards. So where do you turn to? This comes from the power center. This is from the ministry. And Stephen Lecce may not know what's going on in his bureaucracy, but he's responsible for them. So if you're going to organize and you're going to lobby, I would suggest that you turn it there, and that you bring people along who know what they're speaking about, so that they can show Stephen Lecce, so that they can show, speak to your MPP or your MLA if you're in a different province, to say, this is not improving anyone's education. All it's doing is it's making people stupider, and it's creating great inflation, and it's impacting children's mental health, and we see that in the studies. You can say the purpose of public education, in my mind, is to get our children fluent and up to date on the state of knowledge and skills necessary to navigate the world. Teachers are not psychologists. They shouldn't be practicing unlicensed psychology. They have no business practicing psychology on children, and they have no business promoting critical theory. If the education wants, there are parties who want to promote critical theory, start a political party and campaign on that, and let's see if you get the votes to do that, because that's what it depends on. Anyway, that's my presentation. I probably went a little overboard.
Golden, Stephen.
If there's time, I'm
especially that last bit. If you want to promote critical theory, start a party instead of teaching it to kids. Really, really valuable insights. There are some questions in the chat, and you kind of touched on a couple of them. We're running. We're not terribly running off track in terms of time, but we don't quite have time to dive into those questions. I'd love to explore them more with you at another point, and maybe Melanie and I and us can get together and have that conversation, and we can put that up on our channel.
Sure.
Is there a place where people can find your work?
If you, well, probably the easiest way. My name is Stephen Reich, R-E-I-C-H. If you Google Stephen Reich Critical Theory, you'll come across it. I have a number of articles that I've submitted to journals that are either under peer review or I'm waiting for peer review. I have a few articles that I've posted just to open source that are not yet ready in their final form for peer review. I've really just started this journey. I just finished my MA in education, and now I'm heading toward the PhD, where I want to really look at what ed schools are doing. So, I hope to produce more, and certainly if people are interested in having me come talk and educate in terms of, what I do know, and I'm very, honest about saying what I don't know and to bring other people in for that, then maybe through you they can get in touch with me as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I've very much enjoyed our previous conversation together, and I look forward to talking more, Stephen. There's things going on in the chat you might want to check out. Lots of thanks.
Sure.
And one of the questions is how are you surviving OISE? And I just can't let go without
Sure.
without putting that to you.
Well, there are. Listen, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say that there's a lot of people who feel shut down and that they can't really express how they feel because this has taken on almost a religious quality, right? I mean, I find that sometimes when I talk to people and I say, well, did you ever consider like you never used to talk about having an identity 10 years ago? Nobody did. No one in our generation did. We weren't concerned with identity. We didn't talk about it. And they insist that we did. And they insist that how important it is. And to me, it reminds me very much of having a discussion with, someone who, now I'm an atheist, who believes in God. And that, some people are willing to have that conversation, that tension. I come from a tradition, the Jewish tradition, where you're allowed to question and wrestle with that question and ask a religious person, is there a God? Does God exist? Let me prove to you that God does not exist. They'll prove to me that God does exist. But in the Christian tradition, and certainly the Muslim tradition, you don't do that. And you're not really supposed to do that. And so I feel that this has taken over. I think that as societies become more secular, this somehow has given people meaning, that people feel a real sense of meaning around joining this critical theory idea for utopia. I think that the words that they use that are they're like prayers. The land acknowledgments is almost like the Lord's Prayer that we used to say in the morning. So, a lot of people in OISE are either true believers or they understand well enough that they may be excommunicated if they go against what the religion says. But there are a few people that don't. And I find that I always, as you mentioned, Shannon, I ask the question when people say things like, well, when I walk into my classroom, I only use critical pedagogy. And I'll say, okay, well, let's operationalize that. So you walk in, you see a typical Canadian classroom, kids of all different backgrounds or whatever. How do you know what their background is? Like based on their skin color? Like, how do you know if someone's from Jamaica, Somalia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, all different places with their own cultures and languages and religions and histories and whatever? How do you know? And how do you know that they even have an affinity to it? Maybe they're fourth generation Canadians. They're completely assimilated. They have no ties to their culture. People get mad, and I just smile. I say, listen, I'm asking, and we should ask. But I think that's the way. Ask questions. Ask how to operationalize things. I think, and do it with a smile. Some people want to be fighters or whatever. I like to say I'm a lover, not a fighter. So I love all people, and I hope that people come around to realizing that there are serious problems with critical theory in our education system, and particularly to do with identity.
Thanks so much again, Stephen. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.